welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Always a pleasure.
Today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and take a look at a really fascinating period for the early church.
Oh,
We're
okay.
talking specifically about 1830 and 1831.
Gotcha.
And what we've got is this collection of revelations, specifically in Doctrine and Covenants, sections 41 through 44.
Okay.
This period was a time of just explosive growth,
Yeah.
especially in and around Kirtland, Ohio.
I can imagine.
And you can just imagine it was incredibly exciting, but also presented some pretty unique challenges for, this new religious movement.
You can imagine the situation, just all these new people coming in,
Right.
With different perspectives,
Yes.
different traditions,
Yeah.
coming from all kinds of different religious backgrounds,
Exactly.
and trying to create a sense of unity and shared purpose when everybody's coming from different places.
Yeah, how do you unify everybody when they have all these different ideas?
Right.
And they're bringing in their own baggage from previous religious experiences.
Exactly.
And it's right in the middle of all this change
Yeah.
that we get Doctrine and Covenants, section 42.
Okay.
And this is a really pivotal revelation.
All right.
In fact, the Lord refers to it as my law to govern my church.
Wow.
So pretty significant.
That is.
And so today we're going to kind of dive deep into some of these core principles,
Okay.
particularly this foundational law that's in section 42,
Gotcha.
and try to understand, why it was so vital back then.
Right.
But more importantly for you listening,
Yeah.
what does it mean for us today?
I like it.
So hopefully we can give you kind of a clearer picture of these revelations and maybe even some practical insights that you can apply in your own life.
Awesome.
As it says in section 42, if you ask,
Mm-hmm.
you'll receive revelation upon revelation, knowledge upon knowledge.
I love that.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with Doctrine and Covenants, section 41.
Okay.
It's kind of setting the stage here.
Yeah. Yeah.
The saints have gathered in Ohio, and they're really eagerly awaiting this law
Yeah.
that had been promised to them in a previous revelation in section 38.
Interesting.
They're really looking for specific direction on how to proceed.
Yeah, they've been told to gather.
Exactly.
And now they need okay, what's next? What do we do?
What's the playbook?
Yeah, what's the playbook for
Right.
making this work?
But before he gives them all those specifics, the Lord shares some really important principles in the first 6 verses of section 41.
Okay.
And it's about how to be ready to even receive the guidance.
Interesting.
So what would you say when you read those verses? What stands out to you as particularly important for preparing to receive instruction even today?
Yeah. Well, what I find so interesting is this emphasis on approaching God with humility
Right.
and a real willingness to learn.
Yeah.
The Lord talks about, those who come unto him.
Mm-hmm.
And he stresses the importance of receiving his word as if it's coming directly from him,
Right.
not just through some, intermediary.
Like a prophet.
Even, yeah.
Yeah.
It's this invitation to listen with an open heart,
Yeah.
an open mind, ready to accept what's given.
Yeah. And not just accept it,
Yeah.
but act on it.
Right. It's not just about hearing the words.
Mhm.
It's about really being receptive to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
And so it makes you think, how often do we approach seeking guidance with that same level of humility and commitment
Right.
to actually do what we're asked?
Exactly. Like how often are we going to the Lord and saying, okay, I'm ready to be totally obedient?
Right.
Yeah. And that's a tough question
It is.
because sometimes we just want the answer that we want.
Right.
Yeah. We're not really ready for the real answer.
And that might require us to change. And that's
Right.
hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how verse 5 really drives this point home.
Okay.
It gives us a definition of what a disciple is.
Okay.
He that receiveth my law and doeth it,
Mm-hmm.
the same as my disciple.
Powerful.
It's not just about intellectually agreeing with it
Right.
or saying, oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
It's about actively living according to that law.
Right. It's about action.
It's about action.
Walking the walk.
Right.
Not just talking the talk.
Yeah, so being a disciple isn't passive.
Right.
It's this active engagement
Totally.
with God's instruction.
Yeah.
So as we consider our own discipleship,
Mm-hmm.
it really prompts the question, are we approaching seeking guidance
Right.
with that same level of readiness and
Yeah.
commitment to action?
Really good question.
And that's something that this early section really invites us to think about.
Yeah. I love that.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper
Okay.
into Doctrine and Covenants 42.
Right.
And the revelations we're looking at today really underscore just how significant
Yeah.
this particular revelation was.
Okay.
It was considered one of the most important early revelations.
Gotcha.
It was one of the first to be published.
Interesting.
And for quite a while, it was simply known as the law.
Wow. Just the law.
That kind of tells you
Yeah.
how important it was.
Sets it apart.
Yeah, and while it's not, an exhaustive list of every single commandment,
Right.
the principles laid out in section 42
Yeah.
were really foundational for the newly restored church.
Right.
It provided a framework for how the church would be organized,
Okay.
how members should conduct themselves,
Gotcha.
and even how they were to care for each other.
So it's not just about personal behavior. It's also about how the church functions as a whole.
Yes, absolutely.
And how the members interact with each other.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these principles weren't just relevant
Yeah.
for that specific moment in time.
Right.
They have lasting application.
Yeah.
So the sources we're looking at really encourage us to consider
Mm-hmm.
why these particular principles were so crucial
Right.
for those early saints
Okay.
and why they still hold significance for us today.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So we're going to explore a couple specific sets of verses here.
All right.
We're going to look at 4 through 9,
Okay.
11 through 17,
Gotcha.
56 through 58,
Okay.
then 18 through 29,
Great.
30 through 31,
Correct.
40 through 42,
Gotcha.
and finally 43 through 52.
Wow. That's a lot.
I know it's a lot,
But I'm excited.
but it's good stuff.
Okay.
And we're going to kind of dig into these core ideas and think about how these laws
Yeah.
really demonstrate God's care and love.
Okay.
It's almost like we're dissecting
Yeah.
a key piece of legislation
Right.
to really understand the underlying purpose behind it.
That's a good way to look at it.
So as you think about these verses and you kind of go through them,
Yeah.
what stands out to you as maybe particularly relevant to challenges
Right.
that people might be facing today?
Well, when you look at these different groupings of verses,
Yeah.
you start to see some really interesting themes emerge.
Okay, like what?
Well, things like the importance of teaching
Right.
and supporting one another,
Right.
warnings against specific behaviors,
Right.
guidance on how to care for those who are sick.
Okay.
And this really significant principle of consecration. Right.
Which we'll talk about more in detail in a little bit.
Absolutely.
But through all of it, you can see this pattern of divine care
Yes.
and a desire for the saints to build a righteous and unified community.
Yeah. And so as you're listening to this and you're thinking about the law,
Mm-hmm.
what stands out to you as particularly relevant
Right.
to challenges you might be facing or needs you see in your own community?
That's a good question for all of us to ponder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so let's zero in on something really central to this section,
Okay.
which is the law of consecration.
Yeah.
This is found in verses 30 through 42.
Gotcha.
And the material we're looking at today
Yeah.
connects this to the early saints' efforts
Right.
to live this New Testament ideal
Wow.
of having all things common,
Interesting.
as we read about in Acts chapter 2
Mhm.
and also in 4 Nephi,
Okay.
with this ultimate aim of having no poor among them,
Right.
as described in the book of Moses.
I see.
That sounds like a pretty significant undertaking. It really was a big shift in how they thought about their possessions.
Right.
You know, when Joseph Smith arrived in Kirtland,
Yeah.
he found that some of these new members were already trying to share their property with each other.
Just kind of organically doing it?
Yeah, it was a sincere effort
Wow.
to follow those examples that they saw in those early Christian communities.
Yeah.
But Section 42 provided the Lord's specific instructions on how this principle was to be actually put into practice.
Okay, so let's define consecrate,
Yeah.
because I think it's a word that sometimes,
It can be a little bit misunderstood.
yeah, it's a little bit misunderstood.
Yeah.
So our source defines it as to set something aside for a sacred purpose.
Okay.
So based on these verses in section 42,
Mm-hmm.
how did the early saints actually live this principle?
Well, what's really interesting is it wasn't necessarily about a complete communal ownership in the
Yeah.
way that some people might interpret all things common.
Right.
Instead, individuals were to dedicate their properties and possessions to the church as needed
Okay.
under the direction of the bishop,
Okay.
and they would then receive back a stewardship, the resources necessary to provide for themselves and their families.
Interesting.
And any surplus was used to care for the poor
Okay.
and those in need.
Okay.
So it was a system designed to really foster economic equality
Okay.
and make sure that everyone's basic needs were met.
So it wasn't just about, giving everything away.
No,
and having no security for yourself.
not at all.
Yeah.
It was about stewardship and making sure that everyone was taken care of.
Right, so not absolute communal living
Right.
in the strictest sense,
Exactly.
but more about recognizing that everything we have
Yeah.
ultimately comes from God
Mm-hmm.
and should be used to bless others.
Right.
I think that's a really important distinction
It is.
to kind of understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental change in perspective. It's about seeing ourselves as managers or stewards of these resources that ultimately belong to God
Yeah.
rather than as the absolute owners of them.
It's a humbling thought.
It is.
And while we as Latter-day Saints today
Yeah.
don't live the law of consecration in exactly the same way
Right.
as those early saints did,
Mm-hmm.
the information we have points out that we do make a covenant to live it
Interesting.
in the temple.
Yeah.
So how do we kind of bridge that connection between that formal covenant
Right.
and our everyday lives?
That's a great question.
Right.
Yeah.
How do we take that very formal covenant and apply it
Mm-hmm.
to our everyday life?
Yeah. How do we live the law of consecration today
Yeah.
in a way that's meaningful and makes a difference?
Yeah, and the material encourages us to really think about how we can dedicate
Right.
what God has given us,
Yeah.
our time, our talents, our financial resources,
Mhm.
to really bless those around us who are in need.
That's good.
And it even mentions the hymns, because I have been given much, as a way to spark ideas and think about that.
It's a great hymn.
Yeah, so really kind of prompting you to consider
Yeah.
the daily opportunities that we have
Right.
to live this principle in our own way.
Exactly. It's not always about making those grand sweeping gestures. It's
Often-
often in those small,
Yeah.
consistent acts of service and generosity.
Yeah, the small and simple things.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift our focus just a little bit
All right.
and talk about revelation,
Okay.
both for the church as a whole
Mm-hmm.
and for us individually.
Gotcha.
Our sources bring together Doctrine and Covenants 42.61,
Yeah.
65, 68,
Okay.
and Doctrine and Covenants 43.116 to really shed some light
Okay.
on this important topic.
Yeah.
It emphasizes this core idea that God guides his church through revelation.
And Section 43 is particularly clear about that.
Okay.
You know, the Lord's established way of guiding the church.
Yeah.
He explains that the prophet is the one through whom revelation and commandments are given for the entire church.
Right. And that's so important,
It is.
especially during a time when the church was still so new
Right.
and probably more vulnerable to individuals claiming divine authority.
Right. You can imagine the potential for confusion
Exactly.
and disunity
Yeah.
if everyone just felt like they had the authority to, dictate doctrine and direction for
Right.
the whole church.
Right.
And, our material even raises the scenario of someone claiming to have a revelation
Oh, yeah.
that contradicts what the prophet is teaching.
Right.
So how does Section 43 address that kind of situation?
It's very direct.
Okay.
The Lord states very clearly,
Mm-hmm.
no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith Jones.
So that's pretty clear.
It's pretty.
Yeah, there's a very specific channel
yes.
for revelation for the church.
Yes. And so that establishes a clear line of authority,
Mm-hmm.
and it emphasizes the importance of following the guidance
Right.
given through the prophet.
Absolutely.
And that principle of heeding prophetic counsel
Yeah.
has really remained a cornerstone
Yeah.
of the church's structure ever since.
Yeah.
So while the prophet receives revelation for the church,
Mm-hmm.
what about us as individuals?
Right.
What about personal revelation?
Yeah. How do Sections 42 and 43 address that?
Right. So that's where Doctrine and Covenants 42.61 and 65 through 68 come in.
Okay.
These verses really assure us that if we ask in sincerity and faith,
Mm-hmm.
we will receive personal revelation.
Right.
And the Lord even talks about giving us guidance line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little.
I love that.
It's a process
Yeah.
right?
Gradual learning.
of gradual learning and increased understanding
Yeah.
as we actively seek it.
And Section 42 also encourages us to seek peaceable things.
Right.
And those things which bring joy through the influence of the Spirit
Yes.
as a way to recognize and confirm that personal guidance.
So it's about kind of tuning into those promptings.
Yes.
And those feelings of peace
Yeah.
and joy
And recognizing them
as we're receiving guidance.
as messages from God.
Right. And not just dismissing them as just random thoughts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to pay attention to those things.
It's a beautiful balance, isn't it?
It really is.
This clear and established channel of revelation
Yeah.
for the whole church
Mm-hmm.
through the prophet,
Right.
but also the opportunity for each of us
Yeah.
to receive personal direction
Right.
tailored to our own individual needs.
Our own circumstances.
Yeah.
Our own questions.
Yeah. And the sources that we're looking at today really encourage us
Yeah.
to reflect on those peaceable things,
Right.
those joyful experiences that we've had through the Spirit
Yeah.
as a way to recognize God's hand in our lives.
It's a great exercise.
It is.
To kind of look back and see those moments where we felt that guidance.
And to really pay attention to them.
Exactly.
So as we kind of bring this deep dive to a close,
Okay.
it's really clear that Doctrine and Covenants sections 41 through 44 lay such a crucial foundation.
Absolutely.
We've talked about preparing ourselves spiritually to receive God's word,
Right.
the fundamental principles outlined in the law
Mm-hmm.
in section 42,
Right.
and that essential understanding of how revelation works
Yeah.
for both the church as a whole and for our own personal growth.
Yeah. It's all connected.
It is.
And it all builds upon each other.
Yeah. And I love how you mentioned earlier that promise.
Right.
If we seek with an open heart and mind,
Yeah.
we will continue to receive
Revelation upon revelation.
revelation upon revelation.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's not a one-time thing.
No.
It's this constant unfolding
Right.
of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. As we seek it.
So here's a final thought for you to kind of ponder
Yeah. Yeah.
as our conversation comes to an end.
Right.
Think about how these foundational principles, this idea of unity,
Right.
consecrating what we have,
Yeah.
heeding wise counsel,
Mm-hmm.
these principles that were established right
Mm-hmm.
in these really early revelations.
Yeah.
How do they continue to influence communities and individual lives today?
That's a great question.
And maybe even beyond a specifically religious context,
Yeah.
what laws or core principles
Right.
guide your own communities
Mm-hmm.
or even your personal journey?
That's something for all of us to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive,
My pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
Until then.
Out in the chaos, we rose from the dust. A fire in our hearts, but who could we trust? 1,000 voices, a million ways, but none could shine through the dark like his face. He spoke in thunder, truth from above. He wrote his will in the law of love. Not bound by chains, but set free to serve. The call is clear, give him all we're worth. This is the law of love. Not fear, not force, but the fire from above. We walk his way, we rise, we run, guided by light in the law of love. He spoke in thunder, truth from above. He wrote his will in the law of love. Not bound by chains, but set free to serve. The call is clear, give him all we're worth. This is the law of love. Not fear, not force, but the fire from above. Walk his way, we rise, we run, guided by light in the law of love. He called us disciples, and not just a few, to consecrate all and carry the truth. Not just commandments carved into stone, but hearts made of flesh to be his own. So we obey, not cause we're told, but cause his love breaks every mold. This is the law of love. Not rules to break, but a better above. Give, we serve, we rise, we run, living in fire, the law of love. If thou shalt ask, thou shalt receive. Revelation upon revelation, knowledge upon knowledge. So we obey, not cause we're told, but cause his love breaks every mold.